Hello, and welcome back to Let's Talk About. This episode, I want to talk about gender and gender identity. And if that seems a bit weird to you, and you don't quite understand why I'm talking about gender, then first of all, where the hell have you been living? I mean, this is like one of the most sort of controversial subjects that's going on at the moment in like sort of popular culture. And it for somewhat obvious reasons and for also less obvious reasons. But the point is, for those of you who don't already know what I'm talking about, a lot of this is probably going to sound kind of confusing to you. And hopefully that it just comes from ignorance and lack of understanding of what's going on in the world right now, but maybe not. But before I get onto that in any real detail, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping, which is kind of cool that I've done enough episodes now to be able to do housekeeping. So yeah, go me. So the other day I decided, after I've done, because I've done 3 episodes now, not including this one, I decided I want to post it. I want to post my podcast on Facebook, and I was iffing and ahhing about that for about 3 days, even to the point where it's really sad, but I was like creating the post and then not sending it. I wrote it all out on Facebook and then just deleted it, just because I was really uncertain of one, whether I wanted to have other people see my sort of private little thing, and then 2, I was kind of like, I don't mind people criticising my ideas because I can change them, but just like I just didn't want to have to deal with people being knobs, which I can't be asked to deal with it. But I posted it, and I was surprised at how many people were actually nice about it. I was expecting, like, all I wanted was no horrible comments. So if I got 0 likes or 0 comments, then I would have counted that as a success. Not only did I get like actual nice comments, which I appreciate, like on another tangent, there might actually be people listening now, which I definitely didn't think that for the first 3 episodes, but now there actually might be 1 or 2 people listening, so hello. That sounded creepy, sorry. I promise I won't do that again. So yeah, not only did I actually get some nice comments, which I appreciate, but a couple of people actually said they'd want to actually come on the podcast and talk, which is like, that would actually be professional in some sort of sense. Well, it wouldn't be, it'd literally just be over Skype or sitting in my spare bedroom, but we can pretend at least. But the fact that people offered that is amazing, and that I never expected that at all. So yeah, good on you guys. With that out of the way, all that's good, very happy with that. So on to the actual meat, as she said. So gender identity. It's one of them things that it's defined differently depending on who the person is. So it's hard for me to give a definitive definition. So I'm just going to go off with the general definition of what gender identity is. So generally speaking, gender identity is referring to the idea of your gender and your biological sex being 2 different things. They aren't the same thing. So in short, it's possible to be biologically a man but identify as a woman, and obviously vice versa. But not only that, gender identity isn't confined to the 2 biological sexes. So with biological sexes, you've got man and woman. Essentially, that is defined by your biology, Y chromosome and X chromosome. That's unlikely to change because that is defined as something that is pretty set in stone in our biology. And I guess you could count hermaphrodite, but I don't know what the chromosomes are with that. Actually, it's a good question. I'm gonna Google that. What are chromosomes? How do you spell chromosomes? Okay, yeah, so it looks like that hermaphrodites, their main characteristic is that they've got both male and female reproductive organs, but they can have different variations of chromosomes. So it's not like they just have both X and Y or something, they can have different variations. So it's more to do with the reproductive organs as opposed to the actual DNA. Either way you slice it, that's down to biology, and that's only ever going to change over time through evolution or through mutation, so random chance. So that's what we call biological sex. Those three types of sex are basically set in stone. But the way we've perceived things in the past is that we've said gender and biological sex are the same thing. They're basically two different words, two different terms used to describe the same thing. And that's the way we've perceived things before. But what do you do if you're born as a biological man, but you feel like you're a woman? How do you really characterise that feeling if there's only one way of describing your gender and sex? How do you describe that feeling of being scientifically, biologically a man, but identifying within yourself and feeling in your own mental state as a woman? And a long time ago, people would have just wrote it off as, oh, he's a bit feminine. People probably would have just assumed, I imagine throughout the early 1900s, people would have just said, oh, he's gay. But what we've realised over the past 2, maybe 3 decades is that it's not just an act that people can turn on and off. It's not like you're just a man who likes to wear a dress or dress a bit feminine or act a bit feminine. It's 100% an actual mental state that you cannot choose. Just like you can't choose being gay or being depressed. You can choose whether you act on them things, but you can't choose them feelings. You can't alter your authentic mental state. And a lot of people have a really hard time getting their head around this, because if you're born as a person who identifies with the biological sex that they are, then this is obviously really foreign to you, because you've grown up in a world where, one, we've only ever really taught the idea that there's 2 genders, and 2, you've never really been able to truly comprehend what it's like to be in a certain body and then feel like you don't identify with the anatomy of that body. So it's like many different things. If you've not been exposed to something and you've never been taught something and you've never had to relate to something, then when someone else comes along expressing their opinions, it's likely that you're not even going to be able to understand or comprehend it. And I understand that. And I think it is unrealistic to expect someone who's in like their 70s or 80s to understand this straight off the bat. Because to be honest, even myself, like when I first really tried to learn about it, I have to admit I didn't quite understand it at first, because I was still using the mindset of gender meaning the same thing as biological sex. So when someone was saying that they don't identify with their biological sex, then it did confuse me at first, because what was going on in the back of my head was just, but you factually are a man, or you factually are a woman. And it was only when someone explained to me, no, there's the difference between sex and gender, which it wasn't really understood and used in everyday language over the past hundreds of years, but now we understand it more, and we understand that gender and sex are different. And there is actually a medical term for this called gender dysphoria. So it's not like just personal preference, like it's not as simple as a choice. It's not like someone can just say, today I'm going to feel like I'm a man. Just as someone can't decide, today I'm going to feel like I'm going to be straight. So it's good that we actually acknowledge that there are people who feel this way. Because if there's anyone watching this who just says, no, that's not a thing, gender and biological sex are the same thing, well, you can have that opinion, but people do feel this way. So what do you do with them people? Do you say, no, you don't feel them feelings? We're just giving a name and acknowledging that people feel this way, and what we do after that is a separate thing, but you can't argue with the fact that people do feel this way. And if you want to say, okay, all these men who identify as women and feel like they're not in the right body, they're all just, they don't understand their feelings correctly, and they just want to dress like a woman. That's all it is. Well, I mean, if we're going down that path, then every time someone says, I identify a certain way, I can just say, no, I disagree that you feel that way. You don't understand your feelings. I understand your feelings better than you do. End of conversation. And if it gets to that point, what's the point in having the discussion? What's the point in carrying on the discussion if you're just going to disbelieve everyone's own personal feelings? So assuming you agree with that, the next thing that I thought, at least when I came to terms with what this meant and I really started to understand it, the next thing that I thought is, well, okay, how do we help these people? But never once in the whole time that I was talking about this or thinking about this or watching videos on this did I ever get bothered by the fact that people identified this way. I just thought, that's your thing, that's nothing to do with me. Even when I didn't understand it, it didn't bother me. I was just kind of like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. And obviously now I think it does. But it's incredible that if you go online, YouTube especially, and Twitter as well, there's so many people, like a huge amount of people who are really, really butthurt about the whole concept of gender identity and people identifying as something other than their biological sex. And people go off the fucking handle. It like as though it's the end times or something. And it's crazy, really, because if you think about what it is, so everything I've described to you, all that's really happened is that there's been something that's going on within our biology as humans for many, many years, and now we finally have acknowledged that it's a thing, and we have changed our words slightly to acknowledge that thing. That's it. And even on a personal level, so the way that people self-identify, all we've done really is acknowledge that more. The way people self-identify, and I'm guessing now because I've never been through this, but that's never really, I would imagine that's never really changed. I imagine that it's just became more acceptable now, so people are more open to acknowledging it and talking about it and coming out, for lack of a better word. So even like 100 years ago, when it would have been taboo and just not understood and looked down upon, there were probably men who identified as women who felt the same way as men who identify women today. So chances are that part hasn't even changed. All it is we've just acknowledged that something exists and changed some words around. That's it. So the correct response to that should be usually, oh, okay, so we've got this thing that we now know exists, and we're all good, productive, nice members of society, so let's work together to find a way that we can help these people. And a lot of people have done that, but a lot of people on the other side have made it their entire project almost just to tell these people that they're either mentally ill or evil, or they just don't belong in society, that they're not welcome. And I don't understand why people get so bothered about something that is purely about the way an individual identifies. For example, if I came out as identifying as a female, how the hell does that affect anyone else? There's nothing I could do in that scenario that would affect you in any way that's going to be negative. There's nothing to be scared of, because everything would be about myself. Like, I would decide, okay, well, I've came out now, so I can dress the way I really want to in public. I can behave the way I really want to in public. Maybe I can start an actual medical transitioning process, which people can do nowadays, and it's more and more common. But none of them things affect you, person on Twitter, that's really offended by this. But the thing is, these people, and this gets me onto my next topic, these people have made up these scenarios in their head where it really does actually affect them. In their mind anyway, it affects them loads. So one of the most famous or infamous examples of these scenarios that people make up to stoke fear is, well, I say famous, it's only really famous if you actually follow this kind of stuff, but it was in Canada. There was a video released with a professor called Jordan Peterson, who's somewhat semi-famous now, and he was arguing with people on a college campus. I can't remember whether it was in Canada or in the US, but they were arguing about a Canadian law that was being passed, And his argument was that Canada had put a law into place where if you don't correctly use someone's pronouns, so she, her, his, him, if you get that wrong, you'll face like legal consequences, whether that's going to jail or something like that. So he was arguing that it's basically a violation of free speech. You can choose to identify a certain way, but other people in society have a right to not use the same words that you want them to use. They have the freedom of speech to say what they want. And the thing is, when you first hear that, most people sort of go like, oh, well, that is a tricky situation because free speech is important and people need to have the right to have free speech, and oh yeah, it's quite mean and it's going to make someone feel bad if you get the gender wrong, but oh, free speech is very important. And people were having this conversation. But the thing is, how he characterised what that law was completely wrong, like utterly completely wrong. And people just took his word for it. People didn't bother like looking into it or seeing like what the truth was. Someone was scared about like, oh, the transgenders are trying to make us say certain words and oh, that's not very nice. And no one bothered to fact check him. They just sort of believed him. Because when you actually read the bill, it's incredibly simple. Literally all it says is that, you know how you have like protected classes, so you can't fire someone for being gay. You can't fire someone for being married, you can't fire someone for religious beliefs, that kind of thing. All they did was added gender identity to that part of the law. So you can still misgender them, because that, just like you can, if someone says they're gay, I can say, no, you're not, you're straight. I'd be an arsehole if I did that, but I'm allowed under the law to do that. So just the same as that, with this Canadian law in place, I'm still allowed to misgender someone. But all the law did was it made it so that you can't fire someone or refuse someone's service in a shop because they identify as a certain gender. So when you highlight the law itself, the reality of the situation, that becomes a lot more reasonable, because to argue the opposite, you'd essentially be saying, no, I want to allow people to discriminate against these types of people. Because once the law's in place, if you try to make an argument for why it shouldn't be in place, that's essentially what you're trying to argue. So this video with Jordan Peterson, and honestly you should go watch it yourself, because that's not the only part of the discussion they have. There's other things they talk about, like for example, one of the students says, once I've told you how I identify, will you refer to me with the correct identification? And he still says no. So at that point, to me, it feels like, and this is what I was referring to earlier, it's like you're going to the nth degree just to not adhere to how someone wants to identify. It's like so much energy into something that really doesn't affect you. And the students bring up a pretty decent analogy where they just say, well, would you do this with my name? If I said to you, oh, I know my birth name is Michael, but I want you to call me Dan, because that's just my nickname from childhood. I've always been a Dan. Would he go, no, that's not your correct name, and I'm going to call you by Mike, even though you want to be referred to as Dan, I'm going to call you Mike. It's unlikely that people do that, because one, it's an identification thing, it's a self-identification, so if that person wants to be Dan, they can be Dan. And also, it doesn't affect him at all. Like, whether the person is called Mike or Dan has absolutely no effect on the rest of this other person's life. And it's not an exact analogy, because you can change what your nickname is. You can't really change the way you identify your gender as. So it's not exact, but it's somewhat close in the logic of it, I guess. Go watch the video. It's really good. If you'd literally just search for Jordan Peterson, Canadian Law College, something like that, you'd probably come up with the video. But getting back to the original point of bringing up the video, even though he mischaracterised the law that he was trying to argue about, this has still become an argument for why people should be afraid of the whole concept of gender identity and what it means, because they genuinely argue that people who identify this way are trying to force you to speak a certain way. They're trying to force you to use certain words, and if you don't, you're going to get sent to jail. And I've met people who think this, so it's not even rare. Like, I've met quite a few people who think this, and I'm sure you will find some people who do actually think you should force people into using the correct identifications, but they are a really small percentage of the population. And just like we don't spend time debating whether it's okay to murder, because only a very small percentage of the population will think it's okay to murder, why the hell do people spend so much time arguing about how people identify? I mean, it's argued about on the news, for fuck's sake. And it's not even equivalent, because murder affects other people. How someone identifies their own gender doesn't affect anyone else other than themselves. So what you tend to see with people like this is that when push comes to shove, they will say something along the lines of, I've got no problem with the way you identify, but you can't force me into using certain words. And they frame it like that because it makes it sound like they're more reasonable, because it sounds like they're saying, oh, I'm nice enough to let you identify the way you want to. Oh, how nice of me. But you definitely aren't going to make me speak a certain way. And it sounds almost reasonable when you say it like that. But the problem is that no one's arguing anything other than that. The vast majority of people who identify as a different gender, which by the way is still a stupidly low percentage, like I think it's like in the realms of like 1% of the country, a vast majority of that population who wants to identify that way, if someone says he and they identify as she, they're not going to kick off instantly and try and get you sent to prison. They're just going to say something along the lines of, oh, actually, it's she. That's it. That's all they'll say. And then the other person, if they're a normal person, will go, oh, sorry about that. Okay, she. And then that'll be the end of the conversation. There isn't this mythical person that expects everyone to get the gender right every single time, perfectly, like some kind of the equivalent of like gaydar, where you can just tell what someone's gender is, regardless of the way that they're dressed, the way they look or anything, even people you haven't met before. So they've made up this story in their head that these type of people exist and they want to take away our free speech and freedoms, and it just doesn't exist. So why the hell are these people arguing about this thing that doesn't exist? And they've been told over and over again that it doesn't exist. So it makes me think that there's some kind of repression going on. So there is probably a case of it's similar to with the homophobia side of things, where those who are extremely homophobic sometimes turn out to be homosexual themselves, due to being repressed, especially if you've been growing up in like a religious household that doesn't approve of that. There's probably some cases of that where people don't identify with their biological sex, but they don't feel comfortable with the thought of that, so they repress it, and the symptoms of that is that they become incredibly anti-gender identity, so they really, really care about it, but in the wrong way. But still, if I was to play devil's advocate, even though they are wrong that this is a pressing issue that they need to be scared of, and even though they've misinterpreted all of the arguments that they base this upon, you can say at the very least that if they were true about that is something to be worried about. So if they were actually correct that 90% of the population of those who identify as a different gender was saying, no, I want to force you to speak a certain way and use certain words, then that is something that I'd say it's understandable to say that might not be a good thing. It's still, however, not understandable to worry about it, because even if 100% of that community wanted to create like really draconian laws around this, which they don't, but even if they did, they are still the vast minority of the entire population, and society is never going to create laws that benefit the minority to the detriment of the majority. It's just never going to happen that way. So even if the entire of that community wanted this, it's still not something to be worried about. So it's why people get so bothered. Even when I give them all the benefit of the doubt, it's still not something that needs to have this much attention on it, especially when we've got shit going down that's actually a problem, like gun violence in America is actually a problem, global warming is actually a problem, and people are making videos about how terrible it is that Bob now identifies as Sandra. Like, it's who cares? Like, let them be who they want to be, just let them be. The conversation should be about how we help them be who they want to be, or who they, not even what they want to be, who they feel like on the inside. Let's help them be that, reflective of that on the outside. But the fact that we're still debating this is kind of stupid. Like, how can you debate with someone whether they feel a certain way? But it boggles my mind. Anyway, but when I was playing devil's advocate with that argument, that was something that, even if I give them all benefit of the doubt, I can just about see, okay, in the worst case scenario, I can understand. I don't agree, but I understand. But there's arguments that it's just bonkers. So, for example, one of the arguments that I've heard a few times is that, oh well, you're just changing words to mean new things. What? Seriously? That's an argument for why we shouldn't accept people identifying as a different gender than their sex? Like, we change words all the time. That's how language works. Like, we started off with grunts, and we probably just pointed at things and went, and then eventually that became rock. Words change over time, depending on the culture. Do I even need to explain this? This seems so obvious to me. Like, we've learned new things. So we've learned that gender identity is not the same as biological sex. So we change the meaning of the word gender to reflect that. That's no different than how language changes through society all the time. So, like, gay used to mean happy, and now it means what we refer to as gay now. And I'm sure back then people moaned about the changing of the word gay then, but it's exactly the same as that. And I wonder if these people would also say, no, gay should stay as being happy and it shouldn't mean gay. Because if they don't, then they've got no leg to stand on. But even so, even though the word has changed, who cares? Like, it doesn't matter at all that a word has changed. Like, do you really care that a word has changed? And if you really do, then take a look at yourself, because it really doesn't matter. In the grand scheme of things, changing some words doesn't matter. It's the meaning behind them words that really matters. So if we kept sex and gender to mean biological sex and then created a brand new word, would you have been okay with it then? Or would you have just said you can't just create words? Because if that's your argument, then that's factually wrong, because we do create words. That's what we've done from the start of the human species. So I'm not even going to go on that point any longer, because it's so obvious. But the other point that I hear is, and I remember this was the first one where, as I was watching these videos like 5 or 6 years ago, this was the first one where I sort of started to realise, hang on, they aren't making good arguments. So a lot of people will say, well, if you can identify as, if you're a biological man and you identify as a woman, then I can identify as a car. And the argument is basically, if you can just willy-nilly change the definition of what these words mean, then I can add my own definition as well. And this is one of them things where if you just sort of take a brief glance at that, it could sound convincing. But it's really disingenuous, because do you actually identify as a car? Because if the answer to that is no, then fuck off. Because these people who are saying, well, I'm a biological man, but I identify as a woman, they're not just willy-nilly saying, oh, I feel like I'm going to be a woman today. They actually feel that way. That's an actual feeling. So if you're saying, well, I can just identify as a car, then, well, do you? Because if you don't, then that's just completely disingenuous, because the majority of people don't identify as a car, so it's not a discussion we're having. But just for the sake of the argument, let's pretend that they are, but not identifying as cars, because that's, when people say that, they're obviously joking. But let's use something that might actually be a plausible comparison sometime in the future. So in the next 100 to 200 years or so, AI is going to seriously take off, and we are eventually, assuming we don't kill ourselves in the time being, we're eventually going to get to the point where AI becomes so indistinguishable from humans that the line between human and machine kind of blurs a little bit. So, like anyone who's played a game, what's that game called? The Detroit something or other. I've got to Google it now. Detroit Beyond Human, that's what it's called. In that game, the AI and the humans kind of... It's almost like that the AI are kind of like immigrants or something, where they are seen as like second-class citizens, but they live within the society. But anyway, so it's in games, it's in books, it's in films, where the AI becomes so indistinguishable from humans that it's hard to tell the difference between what's human and what's AI. But not only that, if people start to cyber enhance, which is essentially where we start swapping out our organs or changing our limbs for machine versions of the same thing, so literally getting bionic arms or machine-driven hearts, it gets to the point where it's not a stupid thing to say that you are not fully human anymore. So there will be a point eventually, I would imagine, in 200 years or so, where people start to define humanity and machinanity. I don't know what you call that, but the equivalent of humanity for machines. That becomes like a sliding scale, the same as gender and sexuality is. So rather than saying I am human and that is a robot, it would be kind of like, well, I identify somewhere in the middle of AI and human. And the thing is, when I'm saying that now, most people listening to me say that probably just think I'm stupid, or like gender identity is one thing, and sexuality as like a sliding scale is one thing, but that's humanity and AI being like a sliding scale, that's way out of reach, that's never going to happen. But it's really lacking imagination to think that, because it might not happen, and I might be 100% wrong, and that will never happen ever in the history of our species. But you can guarantee that 200 years ago, people wouldn't have even comprehended the idea of gender identity, let alone argue about it and say whether it's like correct or whether we should be open to it or anything like that. People would have just said even the idea of it is just laughable. Like, it's not even something we should discuss. So the reason why I'm bringing this up in relation to the car thing is to illustrate that over time things can change so much that when you start talking about gaps of 100, 200 years, you can't predict like what's going to be considered normal then compared to what's considered normal now. So a decent example, what's relevant to our time, is that 1,000 or 2 years ago, when everyone was religious, people could understand the idea of there being different religions that all believed in some kind of higher power. They just disagreed on who was right. So the Christians said the Muslims were wrong, and they fought over it, and vice versa. But back then, it would have been very difficult for a lot of the population to comprehend the idea of an atheist, because it's kind of outside of the realms of what you understand. But now, that's incredibly common. And yeah, I think atheists are still in the minority when you're taking the whole world into account. But everyone understands the concept, and it's definitely not 1% of the population. I think it's like 30 something, but don't quote me on that. But the point is that something that would have been considered crazy in the same way that you say like, what? So you can just identify as anything. The way that people say that now, people were saying that 1,000 years ago about atheists. What? So you just don't believe in anything? You don't believe in any God? How stupid. And the irony is that a lot of the people who are saying this about gender identity now are probably atheists themselves. So to try and say that it's somewhat unreasonable or unheard of to add new identities to certain things is just really ignorant on the fact that this has been happening for decades, centuries, millennia. Like, it's always been happening that we've been creating new definitions and identities for certain things, and likely people have always got fucking triggered by it. So this is nothing new. So there's loads more of these type of arguments that I think are bad arguments that I could talk about, but I don't want to go on forever. And if you are interested in this, go on YouTube, because it's everywhere on YouTube, and Twitter's really bad for it. So for example, I only use Twitter to follow people that I generally disagree with, because YouTube's my actual place where I want to go to be entertained. So the YouTube algorithm will show me stuff that I like. It gives me my liberal bubble. But then when I go to Twitter, because I've followed and I make no posts, so it doesn't know anything about me, I've only followed people that I disagree with. So it gives me all these type of things, like how gender identity is terrible. So I know that there's definitely these thoughts out there. So it's almost like I've got my left and right bubble in different places wherever I go. So there's plenty more of those type of arguments out there, if that's what you want to look at. But for me, I've not yet came across any decent points by the people who are saying that gender identity is either not a thing or should not be accepted. The only point that I've came across, which is something that I think deserves discussion, isn't to do with whether it's a real thing or whether we should treat those people with respect or call them their proper identification or anything like that. And it's the whole argument of when should parents be allowed to start treating their children who have been displaying signs of gender dysphoria. So when should they be allowed to do things like hormone treatment or actual surgery? Should they even be allowed to do that? So these are questions that I think actually do deserve discussion, because essentially what it boils down to is, when is it okay for the parent to make a life-changing decision for the child? And we have lots of examples on this. So, for example, if a child is diagnosed with ADHD or some kind of behavioural problem or something like that, then it's the parent's decision on how to treat that. They'll obviously consult with their doctor or physician or whatever, but at the end of the day it is down to the parents to decide on the treatment. The kid can't decide what they want to do, for example. So at that age they don't the kid doesn't have any autonomy over certain things. The parents make the decisions. And this is definitely a discussion we have, because the whole anti-vax movement, the anti-vaccine movement, and actually that's probably something I could probably do an episode on, or at least include in an episode at some point. But the anti-vaccine movement is where people are, it's very prominent in America, where people are scared to give their children vaccines because they think that the vaccines cause autism or cancer or something like that. So in that situation, we've decided, at least up until this point, that the parents do have the right to make that decision for the kids. And in the case of anti-vaccines, there's definitely an argument to be made that the parents shouldn't have that right. So, and it's a discussion as well, because should the government force children of the state to take certain medication? And it does become a discussion where there's not an obvious answer. And I think the original question of when is it okay for a parent to start treating their children with hormone treatment or even gender reassignment surgery, it boils down to the same principle. The parents are making a life-changing, probably permanent decision for their children. And for the same reasons, it's a difficult question. And I'm not going to take a stance on it in this podcast, because basically I don't know enough of the details. Like, I don't know the science behind it, if it is reversible, if it's how damaging it could be for someone who's young. I just don't know. And the only thing I will say is that that's one of the things where I think it is worth discussion. But I rarely ever see people actually discussing that. Most people who are still talking about gender identity on the opposition side of it are still talking about the other things that I've talked about, making the same bad arguments. So there's only been, like, I think Joe Rogan did an episode, I think, where he did talk about this, but he also talks about all the other things that I've mentioned in the same episode, so it's only a little bit better. And just to start wrapping up now, really, one thing I do want to have people take away from this is that there are people out there that do feel this way, and regardless of whether you think their feelings are valid or not, they are people who feel this way. So you've got to ask yourself, how are you really going to interact with this community? Because trying to act as though the way they identify just doesn't exist, it's just not constructive. You're not providing anything useful, because what do you think they're going to do? Do you think they're going to say? Do you think you're going to say, no, there's only two genders, and then they're going to go, oh yeah, good point. I've never thought about it that way. No one else has ever said that before. Completely agree with you now, and I no longer have these feelings. It just doesn't happen because let me put it this way. The people who feel this way, they feel this way so strongly, and it's so ingrained in their identity themselves that they're willing to go into surgery and chop off their balls in order to feel the way that they want to feel, the way that they identify. And if that doesn't make you realise that these people aren't just, they're not just having a laugh, they're not just doing it on like a drunken night out, it's something that, and if your response to that is just, oh well, they're crazy, so they're just they're just self-harming themselves, they're mutilating themselves because they're crazy, then it's kind of pointless having the conversation with you, because I could do that for anything that you do or you do to yourselves, I can call you crazy for doing. So I don't want any plastic surgery, for example, but if you do, I could just call you crazy, because that's a permanent transformation that you're doing to yourself. So I could just call you crazy for that. And yet people do that because they, for loads of different reasons, but it's usually that they are in some way unhappy with their body, and so they change it to more reflect how they either see themselves or they want to be seen by others. And if you're okay with that and you don't think that that's crazy, why is it crazy to have gender reassignment surgery? So overall, what I'm trying to say is, try and think about whether what you're actually saying is constructive at all to the discussion that people are having. Because if you're back there with the arguments that I was saying before, the stupid arguments, then you're not changing anything. All you're doing is making people feel bad about themselves. Because people who feel this way, they're not going to change how they feel because you shamed them. At the most, they'll just repress it. And I think people are starting to accept this a little bit more, so it is getting better. Like most things, it does get more acceptable over time. It just takes a lot of time. But it's not really something that I can say for definite, because I'm not a member of that community, and I don't know, I'm not really close with anyone who has gender dysphoria. I only know some people, like sort of tertiary friends, I guess. So it does seem at least that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and like many different things of this kind of nature, it's going to improve as people become less ignorant on the topic. So the more people talk about it, the more people really have the differences explained to them, like the differences between biological sex and gender, how it's just a personal identity and it's not something that's set in stone that other people have to adhere to or anything like that. It'll become more accepted, which is, it's kind of sad that we have to go through this process with every new thing. Anytime there's a change to the way, the status quo, the way people have understood things, we have to go through this process every time of where there's people who are against it, and then over many years it becomes acceptable, and kind of makes you just want to skip the process and just say, like, we know that in 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, it's going to be accepted, so can we just accept it, please? But unfortunately, that's not how people work. So anyway, that is the end of this episode. And this one was a bit different because it's less talking about my ideas and more talking about my views on other people's ideas, which I don't really want to do too many of that because I don't want to spend my time sort of dunking on other people when they're not here to defend themselves. But maybe 25%, 20% of the podcasts I do will be that kind of stuff. The majority of the time I just want to talk about a thing that interests me. But yeah, I also want to do something that I haven't said in the previous podcast because I've not expected anyone to listen to them. But given what I said at the start and that a couple of people might actually be listening now, I want to hear questions. So like if people have any sort of questions or comments, or actually any sort of suggestions for what you want me to talk about in the future. So there was someone who suggested conspiracy theories, and immediately I was like, oh, that's a brilliant idea. So I'm definitely going to do conspiracy theories at some point. I'll probably do like a mashup of different ones rather than an individual conspiracy theory. And then someone else said overpopulation. So what are we going to do about the overpopulation problem? And I thought that is actually really interesting because that's like a whole sort of ethical dilemma, sort of Thanos style. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments mainly, let me know on however you can let me know. I don't really know how, but find a way. And then I'm also going to do a thing, which I'm going to do at the end of every podcast now. I'm going to end with some kind of interesting fact. So, this episode's fact is, it's impossible to hum while you hold your nose. And with that, see you next time.